it kind of cuts to the heart of a lot of telling Alexander's story for me, because very often, all too often perhaps, there's a tendency to think of him as inevitable, as his conquests as inevitable, his victories as preordained. And then when you actually start to look at the ancient sources, particularly like what we have of the earliest accounts of his life, what we had left of the memoirs of his contemporaries, the striking thing is just how often everything was going just terribly wrong.
Hello, I'm Zeb Smith, editor at Aspects of History. He remains one of history's most scrutinized figures, but Alexander the Great's victories were far from inevitable. Recent discoveries are beginning to reshape our understanding of his life and legacy, and the immense personal burden of becoming simultaneously Macedonian king, Egyptian pharaoh, Persian Great King, and a living god. With me on the podcast today is Edmund Richardson, historian and classicist whose book, Alexander, God, King, Man, re-examines Alexander through newly translated sources, groundbreaking archaeology, and a wealth of evidence to reveal a conqueror far more uncertain, contradictory, and human than legend would suggest. Coming up next week, I talk to Anthony Selden as he recounts his 1,300-kilometre journey from the Western Front to Auschwitz, uncovering the stories of those who resisted evil and protected the vulnerable during the Second World War. But for now, here's my conversation with Edmund Richardson. Hello, Edmund, and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to have a chance to talk with you.
So yeah, delighted to get you on this week to discuss your latest book. Alexander, God, King, Man was released last month. To call it merely a biography might be doing it a bit of a disservice, I'd say. Sweeping novelistic account of the Macedonian king's life, as cinematic in its depiction of the quest as far east to Punjab as it is sumptuous in cultural detail and source material. In short, some project to conceive of. Talk us through kind of just how you did and where the seeds of the book lay.
That's firstly so very kind of you to say. I'm really glad you like the book. Whenever I just sort of thought about doing a book about Alexander, like the my self-preservation instinct would normally kick in, because it's just like, this has got to be a terrible idea, because this guy again, and you think, well, both what is there more to say about him? What other stories are there to tell? After thousands of people have written thousands of books about him in the past, but also, how do you kind of find a way through that? You know, how do you find a way to make a story that's been told so many times in so many cultures for thousands of years, feel like a story that's worth telling again?
Yeah, I mean, what is it that keeps drawing you and kind of fellow ancient historians? So, I mean, no doubt you can cite Arrian's quip better than I can paraphrase it. But what exactly convinced you that now was the time and there was still something to unearth?
Well, Arrian is indeed sort of notorious for beginning his book on Alexander almost 2,000 years ago by saying, well, why on earth does anyone need a new book about Alexander? And of course, Arrian being Arrian, he answered that by saying, well, go read all the other ones and then see if you think that's worth asking again. But my answer to that question is kind of the other way around. It's because of all the things that have been happening over the last decade, 2 decades, in our understanding of the ancient world, and particularly of Alexander, that it was worth revisiting the story again. Now, like, when you sort of tell someone that, well, study ancient Greek history or the histories of the ancient world, like, a pretty reasonable reaction can be like, are you not done yet? Like, it's a limited time. It's a limited amount of sources. You've been trying to tell these stories for 2,000 years. How can you not be done yet? But one of the most striking things I found when researching this book was just how much is changing, and just how much history of the past really never stands still. there are so many discoveries that have really made us see Alexander and his legacy and the world that he sort of swept through in a completely different light, whether it's discovering huge parts of the cities he founded, his Alexandrias, which stretched across much of the known world for Greeks, or whether it's deciphering the diaries of Babylonian astronomers who knew him, or whether it's using new technology to do things like untangle the secrets of the night sky, or try to figure out what actually might have killed him. The past is changing so quickly, and I think that sense of a history which was always being made new was something that really drew me to the story.
Yeah, so you start us off kind of in media res with the build up to the Battle of Issus in southeastern Turkey, this image of a kind of forlorn, doubtful Alexander as Darius's army approaches. Is that image of uncertainty kind of on the brink of defeat, is it too easily forgotten amid like his storied achievements? I mean, how important did it feel to depict that his campaigns were not merely these triumphant processions?
It's a great question. And it kind of cuts to the heart of a lot of telling Alexander's story for me, because very often, all too often perhaps, there's a tendency to think of him as inevitable, as his conquests as inevitable, his victories as preordained. And then when you actually start to look at the ancient sources, particularly like what we have of the earliest accounts of his life, what we have left of the memoirs of his contemporaries, the striking thing is just how often everything was going just terribly wrong, just horribly wrong. And the striking thing about Alexander is it's very clear, he's figuring it all out as he goes along as well. He doesn't have any idea what his story is going to turn into. And the people around him, the people who knew him as a child, the people who are his father Philip's generals and soldiers, they don't think they're about to conquer much of the known world. They're all part of a story which they don't quite understand, and which is taking turns which none of them really expect. And that kind of sense of both hope and possibility, but also, this could go horribly wrong at any time, was something I that felt really important to me, because that felt very close. If you try to sort of collect together a lot of the earliest sources that we have, the ones that could be most reliably traced back to Alexander's actual lifetime, or in fragments, then that sense of fear and confusion and possibility and delight and astonishment is something that just shines through them. There's the word in ancient Greek, it's one of my favorite Greek words, psalma, and it's generally translated wonder, but it's not a great translation. Thalma is this just astonishing feeling of possibility, of the world kind of springing into color, of of reality being far brighter and more complicated and more beautiful than you expect, that just sort of takes hold of your whole body and won't let go. And it's that sense of possibility and astonishment I think I was trying to capture when I thought, okay, well, I should begin the book at this moment where Alexander isn't Alexander the Great. He's just this kid sort of standing alone beneath the stars, who's kind of been outfought and outmaneuvered and doesn't really know whether he'll live to see another day.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of kind of wonder, I think much of your book is founded on this kind of prodigious range of sources. And these texts, I think, translated from 12 ancient languages, from Rome all the way to the subcontinent. And as you mentioned earlier, the plethora of archaeological discoveries you mentioned. Were there points during the research stage that you were surprised at how much our understanding of him, what we know about him, how he's been perceived, has changed in the last generation? Or have some of these materials been staring classicists and historians in the face, and it's kind of case of scholastic ambition?
All of the things you said are true, right? And that's the delight of it. Firstly, yeah, so much of what we have, in terms of particularly papyrus sources and cuneiform sources. So a lot of the discoveries were made in Egypt, but also in Mesopotamia, and a lot of in Persepolis and places like that. A lot of these sources have just not yet been translated. They were excavated, they were preserved, they've been catalogued. Maybe if you're lucky, they've been photographed, but they haven't been translated. No one's often even transcribed most of them. So we have very little idea of the scale of what we may be about to discover as some of these materials start to be translated and published, and how some of those new sources, or those sources that we've had for a long time but we're only now just starting to understand, how they might change some of the things we think we know about the ancient world. So the other answer, I think, the other answer is just a few moments of sheer luck, right? Whether that's things like the excavations in the harbor of Alexandria in Egypt, where they started to pull these remarkable things from the seabed, sort of sphinxes and royal portraits, and this kind of cosmopolitan, chaotic architecture and iconographic style, which is part Greek, part Egyptian, part wildly itself. So a lot of this is finding new questions to ask material we already know, already have as well. Starting to think about, okay, well, what could this actually tell us? What could we find under the surface of this text, or kind of hidden in the details of this building, if we look at it in a fresh way? So yeah, assembling sources for a book about Alexander is always going to be a like more than mildly terrifying enterprise, because you're dealing with both so much in terms of so much of the ancient world and the wild, beautiful chaos of Alexander's legacy and all the stories that were told about him after his death. So in that sense, you're dealing with so much, but in another sense, you're dealing with so little. Most, basically all of our surviving ancient sources, Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus, etc., they're all written centuries after Alexander's death, and they're all written very much in the shadow of Rome. So they're histories which are in the business of talking about Alexander for a Roman audience, and they do that in very kind of specific and loaded ways. So we have to really work to find contemporary material, 4th century material, material which might give us a better sense of what was going on and what was going through Alexander's head in his own lifetime.
So I'm just going to apologize to the listeners because there are kind of gunshots behind me at Chalk Festival. So I'll try and mute them out. Very dramatic.
Appropriate in certain ways.
Yeah, slightly anachronistic, but work it through. The subtitles triad, God, King, Man, it implies three quite different identities of the figure of Alexander. These footings, of course, kind of feed into each other. But do you think it's a useful exercise to observe him on those different planes? I mean, the first two come quite wrapped up in mythology and image, but kind of remain quite distinct to, this emotionally complicated, melodramatic son, lover, friend, father that you portray. Was there a balance to strike?
I think there was always a balance to strike, even going back to Alexander himself and how he tried to present himself and how he tried to play all these various parts and how he sort of maybe thought about himself and his own roles in the world. There's always a balance to strike. The thing is, once you get a year or two into the campaign, once you start to see Alexander having to do far more things than just be hegemon of Greece or king of Macedon. Once he's pharaoh of Egypt, once he's king of Babylon, once he's great king of Persia, once he's got all of these titles and all of these roles. You know, far weirder and wilder combination of roles than anyone in human history has had before. He's got to be all these people. He's got to be a pharaoh to Egyptians. He's got to be a great king to Persians. He's got to be a convincing Greek to the Greeks, and he's got to be a Macedonian to his old friends. And he doesn't get to sort of go from one to the other, from man to pharaoh to, you know, as he did towards the end of his life, thinking, like portraying himself or insisting that others think of him as almost a living god in certain ways. Alexander, the invincible god, the Greeks were told to send envoys to. So the complications and the contradictions and the ways in which all of these roles, all of these personas, god, king, man, pharaoh, great king, hegemon, Homeric, sort of young Achilles, reborn, like all of these different roles exist simultaneously, and none of them can quite be sort of forgotten about or left behind. So Alexander has to be all of these different things together, and the strain of that is just immense for him.
Conquest of that kind of vast expanse of territory and beyond. I mean, it remains one of the greatest military achievements and still scarcely believable. But you don't tarry for too long on Alexander as just this military genius. You kind of consider the cultural intersections of his campaigns, and you write very discerningly about his failings as an administrator. Do you think there's been a tendency historically to focus on martial success too much?
I think there have always been many different Alexanders. You know, if you look at medieval versions of him, then he's transformed into this kind of proto-Christian archetype of chivalry in France or England. He's wrapped up in Arthurian tales. He arguably appears, or an avatar of him appears in the Quran. There are Indian stories of him where he's a great philosopher, and there are Persian stories of like adventure and conquest and discovery. But I think you're right that maybe, particularly in the last couple of centuries, there was this push towards this exclusively kind of military version of Alexander, this idea of him as the great conqueror above all, which certainly is true and certainly is something that, we see in the ancient sources, particularly in how Romans thought of him, that Roman idea of Alexander once again being kind of wildly sort of pervasive and hard to get away from.
Hello, Zeb here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show.
But there's always a complication. There's always lots of different Alexanders existing at once and kind of fighting for oxygen at the same time. But I think you're right that particularly as he was kind of talked about in the age of European empires, as he was sort of made a kind of exemplar of conquest and of sort of military success, that there was a temptation to kind of elide several other aspects of who he was. And he's a weird example, right, for an empire builder already, because his empire barely exists as a functional unit, even during his lifetime, and after his death, of course, it all goes very wrong very quickly. So it's quite difficult sometimes to use Alexander to tell your own story or to tell the story that you want to, because both he and his life was so sort of tangled and so rife with contradictions and nuance and many things happening, many of them contradictory at the same time, that getting him to be the straightforward moral of a straightforward story is always going to be really difficult. But then for me, I think that's probably one of the things that drew me to trying to tell the story.
So the campaign, the book, it takes a reader across 3 continents, Egypt to Tajikistan, northern Greece to the Beas River in the Punjab, following Alexander's footsteps across kind of much of the ancient world. Your descriptions of landscape and space are so vivid, and there would be kind of no better advert for traveling to the Middle East and Central Asia. But was there a particular place or discovery or site that has kind of shifted or altered your understanding of him?
Gosh, that's a wonderful question. I'll cheat and say two. The first was the Oracle of Amun, in the western desert of Egypt at Siwa. And this is a place that in almost every story of Alexander has this immense weight of significance, of sort of symbol and of awe, because this is the place that Alexander travels to with a small detachment of his army just after he's been crowned pharaoh. And it's said that in this temple, in the temple of Amun in the far western deserts of Egypt, the god spoke to Alexander, claimed him as his son. And this is a moment which in many of Alexander's ancient historians is hugely important, because it's a moment where Alexander starts to possibly think of himself as more than human, or at least to question his humanity in ways that he never had before. And it's a beautiful story, but the place, Siwa itself, is so strange. Even today, it's wildly inaccessible. You sort of drive for hours upon hours upon hours along the coast, and then south through the desert, and it genuinely feels like nothingness. It's the color drains from the landscape. The air fills with just like haze and grit and sand and then after the longest time you get to this little cluster of lakes and palm trees and ruins, which is Siwa. And the Temple of Amun is tiny. It's this, series of small courtyards on a rocky outcropping, and it was sort of veined with secret passageways, so the priests could kind of watch from pretty much anywhere they chose, without being discovered. But it's such a lonely place, and it's such an unworldly place. It's easy to see how in the ancient world this could be seen as one of those kind of rips in reality, one of those places where it was possible to speak to the gods and hear their voices in return. So that for me was sort of very notable, because it was the awe and the fear and the quietness of that place really made me see the story of Alexander at Siwa in just a whole different light. All right, and my little cheat second thing is Babylonian prophecy. It's a cuneiform tablet written by the astronomer priests of Babylon. A few months before Alexander defeated Darius III, the great king of Persia, at the Battle of Gaugamela, which was, of course, their second great battle and Darius's second disastrous defeat. Darius has asked the astronomers of Babylon to tell him what the future holds. And this cuneiform tablet, which was just published, the translation was just published for the first time a few months ago, is their attempt to do that. And they weave this wondrous and eerie alternate future where it's not Alexander who's about to defeat Darius, it's Darius who's about to defeat Alexander. They say the men of the West will flee, they will run for their ships, Alexander himself will be captured, their armies will fall before the great king. And it's this glimpse of this alternate future that could so easily have been and never was. This thing we talked about a little earlier, these moments where all of the story, all of Alexander, all of this version of the future just hangs on the slimmest of precipices. And the Babylonians looked into the future and they saw a possible reality where Alexander was defeated. And what I like is right at the end when they've unfurled this incredibly pleasant and favorable prophecy for the great king, they say, "Oh yes, and after he's defeated Alexander, the great king will cut Babylon's taxes." So they try to make sure they get a little tax break woven into this vision of the future which the gods have laid out.
Bit of realism coming in. That psychological journey as well, from ambitious young king to this pretty disillusioned, tempestuous, kind of broken figure. Do you think those feats and kind of gaining supreme power altered him, or were the seeds of this kind of later rendition present from the beginning, a kind of evolution of sorts?
So hard to know, right? Because if you read ancient biographies, you know that way they have of basically seeding, and I think that's a lovely word you use, seeding the end in the beginning. So whether or not it's actually there's anything to support this, so many ancient biographers will basically write a life backwards, and they will write or they will reconstruct someone's childhood, someone's early life, based on the later course of their life and what they came to be known for. So obviously, very, very, very few people's childhoods get, copied down and written about in detail. Certainly not when they aren't really thought to be about to turn into anyone. Alexander was just one of many children of Philip II, and just one kid in an extremely chaotic and sort of riven by power struggles court. So no one really starts paying attention to him until he takes the throne, until he crosses into Asia. But I think it's impossible not to be changed by the kind of power Alexander has. You might say, well, he's a king already, isn't he? Like, he's king of Macedon, he's hegemon of Greece. Like how could there really be? How could it really be that different? But the kind of wealth and power that he has is within a few years of the campaign beginning is the kind of wealth and power that almost no one else in all of human history gets to have. He has more money than all of the rest of Greece put together, probably most of the rest of Europe put together. He has seen himself, watched himself be worshipped as a god and take and being given the sort of greatest of honors. He has seen his army level cities at a word of command from him. But he's also seen what the other end of that kind of power looks like. He's seen Egypt, which is scattered with the forgotten tombs of forgotten pharaohs. He's seen what happened to Darius after his power faded away. He's seen Darius's body, the broken body of the great king, wrapped in golden chains that Alexander found on a sort of nameless plain in the east of the empire after years of pursuing Darius. So he's seen just how quickly everything he has could disappear, and that gradually makes him withdrawn and anxious and paranoid and suspicious and full of anger and fear. And that kind of anger and fear just eats through him. It eats through his world, and it destroys so much of what he was able to conquer, what he was able to build.
And then his death in Babylon at 32, it feels like this epoch-making moment, I guess, because we know what might have been, but also for kind of global history and his companions and where they go. What do you think his final months reveal about the pressures and the costs of this empire building project? And thinking kind of counterfactually, how do you envision a world in which he lived a longer life?
It's a great counterfactual, and it's one that so many people, like all the way back to Alexander's own contemporaries, so many people have run and have wondered about. Livy spends a huge amount of one book of his history, like wondering what a counterfactual war between Alexander and Rome would be like. So the possibilities are wild, are absolutely wild, because there's absolutely no sign that Alexander was planning to slow down or that he was planning to do things, in a different way. The boring answer is that it's likely that mortality would have caught up with him sooner rather than later if he carried on the way he's been carrying on. Remember, he's been wounded, really seriously wounded, a very large number of times. He's got scars all over his body. He's had one of his lungs collapse in India. He is still sort of breathing really hard. He's in his very early 30s, but his body feels ancient and worn down and almost broken by years on campaign. So it's hard to know just what he would have tried to do and what he would have successfully done if he had lived. But there's no question that his last months are a bleak time. He's lost his closest companion, his greatest friend, his lover, his advisor, his enforcer, Hephaestion. And the loss has just broken Alexander. It changes him profoundly, and it makes him sort of despairing of the world and his place in it in a way that he never has before. So I think his death comes at a very dark time in his story, but certainly if he had survived, the chances of absolute chaos rolling out across the Mediterranean are extremely high.
Your Alexander flits between kind of visionary leader and ruthless conqueror, and you've spent many years immersed in this world, but I'm intrigued to know just how you kind of regard him personally. Is he a scholarly object, a kind of complicated protagonist, or a friendly companion to you? Where does he fall?
Well, that's a wonderful range of things. Friendly companion, I could never quite think of him as. Also, especially given what happened to people who thought they were his friendly companions, they tended to meet rather bad ends in rather unfortunate situations. I feel like he's a puzzle. He's a puzzle that it's never going to ever be quite possible to solve. He's so many things simultaneously, and the complications, as you said, are kind of what make him him. Without all these complications, without the enormous strain of holding these different worlds together, holding these different ideas of who he is together, it's very hard to see that, the story of Alexander is the same at all, because so much of who he is and what he does comes from this, this anxiety, this uncertainty, this multiplicity, which we see in him.
And in terms of kind of future project, what's up next for you? Any hints you can drop about titles or endeavors?
Gosh, well, the next one's a ghost story, I think. It's a 19th century ghost story. And I guess it's about, what we can't recover from the past, what we have to let go of, the problems we can't solve, the puzzles that are beyond us. Has got a sort of chaotic archaeologist and a infamous con artist and a whole bunch of dubious things happening. But it's kind of it's very early stage. I just need to go sit in a library for a while and try to figure out what it is I'm actually trying to say. I have like 4 or 5 drafts of a proposal, which even I'm not sure what some of them are actually meant to be saying. But that there's those stories that sort of circle around you until you figure out how to tell them. I think that's probably what it's doing right now.
It sounds fab. Not the answer I thought would come. Huge thank you, Edmund, both for taking the time to put flesh on the bones of Alexander and explaining how one goes about tackling such a topic in such an original way. So Alexander God King Man is published in hardback by Bloomsbury. We'll put the links in the description and urge all listeners to have a browse. Great to have you on, Edmund, another time perhaps.
It was such a joy to be on the podcast. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family and keep your eyes peeled for new episodes. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.
Keep your wellness routine going strong all summer. Kachava's new travel packs help you stick to your daily ritual even when you're on the go. Just one packet of Kachava's all-in-one nutrition shake provides complete nutrition wherever you are, with 25 grams of protein, 6 grams of fiber, greens, adaptogens, and more. Simplify your daily ritual. Go to Kachava.com and use code NEWS for 15% off. That's KACHAVA.com, code NEWS.